All right, welcome back to the 7-3 Garage. Today we'll be talking about how to install the Solo Motorsports coil spring conversion kit. And is designed specifically for the F250 diesel truck. I might add this kit also works for Broncos too, depending on what year Bronco you have. I would relay directly with Solo with that. I'm not an expert on Broncos by any means, but most everything on a Bronco is pretty dang similar to the F250s. That's why this kit was designed to be a long travel kit for the two of them. The kit does come with a instructional, but it's mainly just 4 photos. So I figured I'd show you an exploded view of the twin traction beam that you currently have on your truck if you've bought this kit. Now, this is iterative and has way more detail than you really need. But in essence, you're going to need all these down parts if they're fried. Like me, mine was fried except for the pumpkin itself. You can just reseal the pumpkin. It won't be difficult to find those parts, and I will have them in this video as well. But I figured it'd be useful to you guys to have this. It's all over the internet, and to also know exactly what you're doing before you go ahead and start removing these pieces, because you can easily damage your pumpkin if you don't remove it correctly. You can lose some of these down parts pretty quickly whenever you're disassembling these parts as well. And it'll be hard to measure after you've removed them. For instance, your U-joints, you want to make sure you keep those. Now, before you start this build, make sure that you've got a jack stand that looks like this. It'll really help you with raising and lowering the truck. You're going to need it for alignments as well. I did not actually have to use it. I used a similar model. Mine's just one of the larger 10K jack stands that you can buy at O'Reilly's or AutoZone. Costs about $200. Safety is priority, guys. All right, and this tool right here just makes your life so much easier. And you want to make sure that you mount these at the very front, near where your bumper's at. Take off your front bumper, by the way. Just make it easier to get inside and get underneath the truck. So step 1 in the disassembly of the twin traction beam is to remove your hubs, your spindle nuts, and all of your bearings, your lock washers, everything inside the housing. And you want to go ahead and make it a priority to put those aside in order in which you disassembled them. Don't lose those parts. You're going to need replacements, and it's very difficult sometimes because Ford in 1996 and 1997 was very finicky on the parts that they selected, and sometimes they don't always match each other. Some people might have 4-wheel drive trucks, some might have 2-wheel drive trucks. If you had a different year from 95, some of your spindle nuts may not match, and you might have to get a different tool to remove these pieces. Very important to keep order of your parts as you disassemble. Your next order of business will be the bushing at the top, which is part 31 in this schematic. Part 31 can give you a real pain in the neck to remove. And I think I should also probably mention too that finding the right down parts, such as your ball joints or any of the bushings that are connected to the twin traction beam, you need to keep account of. So your very first order of business would look like this. Your tire and wheel are off. You can get these rotors resurfaced, guys, all right? You don't have to throw away your rotors. I had to get rid of mine because they were in bad shape and it was time, all right? But your first order of business here is taking apart everything you see in front of you, just as the image showed in the last exploded diagrams. And I'm going to show some more here in a second. I'm not going to go into full excruciating detail about how to do this. There's plenty of videos online about how to take apart the hub and the 4-wheel drive assemblies. Just make sure, like I said, keep everything you have. Before you start digging into this axle, and your Ford manual, D85 Texas 197 Alpha is going to be the tool you're going to need to get out some of your nuts. Now, everybody has a different tool for this. Even though it says it in the manual, some of us have ones with indirect teeth, some of us have ones with shaved down teeth, other ones are jagged. It really just depends on if you have manual or automatic locking hubs, four-wheel drive or two-wheel drive. Here's your exploded diagram in the Ford manual with your inner and outer locking pin. Want to pay attention. One thing I'm showing you this document for is just for the purpose of that pin. That pin can be very hard to locate. And if it's sheared off, you need to get a new inner lock nut. Your manual lock washer and your automatic lock washer have different identifications. One has more slots than the other. One has squared off slots on the outside with a tooth. That's where that difference in your tool is going to come into play, like I was discussing just a second ago. Ordering the right tool based off the lock washer you have. So get in there, take a picture of what you have if you're not sure. There's plenty of Ford groups out there that can help, but all I can say is pay attention to what you have before you go buy a bunch of stuff. I went out and bought some kits and blindly did not realize what I needed. I won't lie to you guys. It's difficult to figure out which one is the right lock washer kit to buy because there's so many people saying that, hey, this is the right kit. Ford says it's the right kit. No, just because Ford says it's the right kit doesn't mean it's actually going to be specific to your truck. This is the tool that was specific to my truck. If you had four-wheel drive, 1997 F250 with manual locking hubs, this one worked perfectly for what I needed it for. Didn't have to shave it down, didn't have to alter it. It worked great for the first lock nut. Now, everything after that was this oddly shaped lock nut that you can find on, what's it called? Torque King sells it. And it has a strange configuration. It's kind of wave-like. That one will work for this truck. Some of you might end up in this guy's scenario where you had to shave it down. This is an example. This is what I had on my truck for the manual locking hubs for my 96 F250 diesel. That lock nut is typically the one that gives you the most problems, as well as the one behind it. They tend to get seized up. So your tool number 5 right there listed is that tool I was talking about earlier. So at this point, you've already disassembled your hub. In this photo, the hub is showing. So you're going to move on to your top castle nut and your bushings. These gave me a real hard time, guys. All right, this was a pain in the neck. I ended up having to take these to a shop to get them pressed out because I did not have air tools. Now, you might be saying, well, how did you get the rest of the axle apart? Well, you can leave your knuckles and your bushings attached to the axle itself and the housing, and you would just go ahead and remove your leaf springs and your pumpkin and all that stuff, and then you would disassociate all the parts from the pivot beams in the middle of the truck. Now, it is really heavy, and you really don't want to be underneath the truck when you're doing this, so you might want to use some jack stands. I did not have any for this part. You can see my jack stands were supporting the truck at this point, and those are the tall ones that are too tall for the bottom of the axle housing. So that zoomed in part that I showed in the last schematic that I was talking about is your bushings. You can see that this is a direct overview of it. This piece is very, very much so seized in there, and you can see that the slot in the bushing is pointing towards the passenger side of the vehicle. That's the exact way that it is installed, and we'll talk about this later. But the only way to press this out is to beat on it with a hammer, and if you can't get it out with a hammer, what you're going to end up doing is collapsing this nut on top of the bushing, and then you will be forced to use a press. Same scenario here, getting off the top castle nut with your cotter pin. Only the upper ball joint will have a cotter pin and a castle nut. The lower does not. It's got a low profile nut, and that is specifically designed for the housing, so you can get your spindle and everything else and your axle seals and all that jazz straight through and have plenty of space. I'm simply just showing you this photo so that you have an idea of how gummed up and nasty these can get. They have a retainer pin, and that's what keeps it in place. So at this point, we've moved on to the pivot beams and the brackets in the middle of the truck underneath your engine housing. These, in this image, are not the ones you're going to have. These are for a Bronco. I just wanted to show you the difference. These are actually mounted to the outside of the frame. F250s will not have this. But you got to be really careful, guys, before you buy this kit. Go down and look at your pivot brackets, because mine had 5 bolts. Some people have 3 bolts and a 2 bolt or a 4 bolt or a 5 bolt. 97, 96, they did whatever they felt like, guys. Ford just did not really document any things. I was the only documented truck to have 2 5-bolt brackets with opposite mirrored configurations of the bolt. That meant that I had to get a custom-made bracket from Solo, and even he couldn't help me. I ended up having to look online, ended up fabbing my own in the shop just by boring through some holes. Now, this is what the F250 should look like. Most everybody will have this 3-bolt assembly. Where your other 2 bolts come into play would be going in underneath the engine mount themselves. And I will say, if your engine mounts are melted or if they're collapsing, you're going to have a heck of a time trying to get a wrench underneath there to tighten those bolts. So moving right along, these are some original pictures of my pivot brackets. This was the driver's side, actually. They're opposite the way they're listed. Even though the bolt configuration might be right underneath the seat, that is not how they list them. They're opposite, so when you order them, be careful. Driver's side is passenger side is driver's side. These were real beat up on mine. They were not OEM. I had drop brackets. Some of you might have drop brackets. Just make sure that you get some OEM ones. If you do have OEM brackets, hang on to those things. They are gold. Here's some more images of what my brackets looked like when I first got them, and I took a look and inspected. I was missing bolts, guys. It's really dangerous, you know, that you don't inspect or do inspect these parts, okay? This is another image of the drop bracket in the front. I only had 2 bolts holding on what should have been a 5 bolt, all right? Very unsafe. This is kind of what triggered me to start this whole project and to do it right, and to really take my time and document everything for my own safety. And then this guy right here is what it looked like on the front. Nothing was holding that bracket, like I said. And it was very seized up, cracked, and rusted as well. So just a very bad scenario that I had. And this was after I removed the parts. You want to make sure that you put anti-seize on this surface, grind it off, clean it up, rebore out the holes, clean them up out the top, make sure that it's all deburred and everything, so when you put those new bolts through, you won't get caught on any edges. It's just imperative that you pay attention to detail for these little things, because it's going to make your life a lot easier when you go to install these brackets and you don't have to rebore out any of the holes. For some of you, if you have a 2-inch lift on your 4-inch lift, this is an example of a 4-inch lifted truck. This is what I had. It was a jerry-rigged, crappy lift that somebody installed on this truck. Now, if you've made it this far, you might know that I brought up the upper and lower ball joints giving you a hard time. Yeah, this is a picture of one that was totally destroyed. You can see where I've been beating it to heck on the top of the axle ball joint nut, and it just wouldn't come out. So wanted to show you this one last time just as a reminder. Congratulations, if you've made it this far, you've only just begun. So the shock tower needs to come out at this point. Everything should look like this. Shock tower is easy. It's just 4 bolts behind the frame. Underneath the shock tower, there will be a bump stop. You need to grind off that bump stop, cut it off, do whatever you need to do. All of the rivets underneath there, at least 2 of them, must come out. Drive them out of the frame, cut them out, do whatever you got to do. I personally dodge them. Those are going to be your bore points for the coil buckets at the top that you're actually going to put your shock and reservoir into. And then off to the left, you'll see the bracket for the braided cable that's connected to your brake line. You have to grind off that bracket off of the frame. Otherwise, your bucket will not be able to. All right, your last order of business at this point would be to drop your pumpkin. And I'm not going to go on how I did that because I'll be honest with you, it was a pain in the neck. It's a lot easier if you have the buddy system. If you don't, use a jack stand, slowly lower it, let it hit the ground. I would suggest unbolting it first before you do that off of the axle housing. That way the pumpkin, you just drop into an oil pan. It will drop all of your oil. And there really is no drain for this thing, unfortunately. The drain at the front is only for a fill plug, so it doesn't drain. And after an hour of wrestling with the pumpkin, this is probably how you're going to feel. You're going to be pretty mad and pretty angry, and you might even need a drink. but it's out. Congrats. Showing you this picture for a reason. This is your U-joint connected to the pumpkin, the short side, driver's side. This is how nasty they can get, guys. Got to rebuild these. Got to rebuild the boot. Might even need a new boot. And make sure you take off that boot, clean out everything inside it after it's dropped before you reinstall. And I've got videos on this as well, but for the most part, you know what to do. All right, if you've made it this far, then you've already received your kit. Go ahead and get those parts painted or Linexed. I had mine Linexed. Everything you see here is kind of what came in the kit. I had already pulled it out of the box. Got your coilovers, your radius arms, your twin traction beams that are cut and turned. If you want to do some Googling on that and understand what that means, that cut and turn terminology, I didn't know what it meant when I first bought the kit. So do some Googling, and you might even be able to do it yourself if you still feel inclined. All right, so step one is the directions. So your first hole will be made on the passenger side rear pivot box based on the measurements in this picture. So if you want to freeze the video for a moment, take some screenshots or whatever, this is exactly what he will tell you to reference. And it's only 4 photos. Those are your only directions for this entire kit. This is why I'm making this video. Rear hole in the pivot box is your reference hole in the frame. Everybody has these holes on their frame. Something I probably should have mentioned right off the get-go, you need to cut off your old leaf spring connections. They're going to get in your way of your radius arm. Once you've done that, then you need to make sure that you get that measurement correct that's in this image. Front of body mount at pivot joint was 6.25 inches from the first bolt on the left bracket that is connecting to your radius arms on the driver's side rail. This is an image of the passenger side frame rail underneath the wheel well to the right of where your coil bucket would sit after installation. That 3-inch measurement is directly to the edge of this hole. Every F250 truck has that hole, so you don't have to be concerned about if it's going to exist on your frame or not. It doesn't have to be exactly specific, but you got to get within 1/8 of an inch for it to at least get close. In this image, the front of the truck is facing to the left, so it's like if you were standing in front of the wheel well. It's a little more mission critical that you get the left side correct, because this kind of screws with the bottom rivet that's underneath that everybody has a big old fat rivet underneath there. It's going to be in your way. So be 1 inch and 11/16 from the edge of that coil bucket in order to achieve the correct placement of everything. And like I said, things are going to be probably slightly different on every truck, but most everybody has the same exact bolt configuration. So go from the center of that bolt to the edge of the coil bucket, and guys, you'll be golden, all right? But just kind of important that you get these measurements correct. So here's an image of the left side radius arm mount after I had bolted it in from the bottom. There's 2 bolts underneath the bottom of these mounts. You want to bore those first based off the directions, and then bore the other ones through the top of the frame because it'll all line itself up. Kind of important to get the bottom ones first, okay? All right, here's an image of what that looks like when you're done. The top bolts are all bolted up, and you're ready to rumble, guys. You're just going to put your pin straight through for your radius arms. And this next image, I'm going to show you what that looks like. You're going to have these 2 oddly shaped bushings. All right, in this image, you got everything bolted up. You've got your Heim joint inside with your jam nut. Your jam nut is the big fat nut. You do not see it in this image because I had not installed it. I was just doing measurements. But you need to make sure that there are 3 threads exposed on the large jam nut that goes on top of this. So it'll come butted up close to the radius arm, the end of that radius arm, and you want to put anti-seize on everything. And then I would also go ahead and take it a step further and put some lithium grease inside of your Heim joint. There's going to be 2 coupled bushings in between. You put that on. And this is me just having a good old time trying to install these radius arms. I believe the wrench that I was using was 1 inch and 11/16 on the left side, and just an adjustable on the right. I would recommend getting yourself 2 of the big wrenches. They're different size nuts on both sides. And my mistake here, guys, was getting these all tight and then forgetting the jam nut. Don't be me, all right? Learn from my mistakes. That's why I'm making this video. Here's part of your finished product here. Just remember, like I said, add the jam nut to the inside of both of those radius arms. Your next part would be to attach the radius arms. Use a mallet for that to attach them to the twin traction beams. Make sure the surface is free of paint, all right? Because mine was not, and I had a hard time. Next order of business is installing your coil buckets. Like I said, you got to bore those holes based off the directions and match up what you have here. This is all pure measurement, guys. There is no stencil for this that he provides. Just dodge the rivets underneath the frame. On the right side there, you're going to have to bore in about 1/16 of an inch into the coil bucket where that 6-sided brake line connects. And then you make sure that you have those brake lines seared off. Like I said, they got to be cut off the frame. Here's your finished product, the coil bucket. On the right side, again, take note of that braided brake line. There is a retainer clip that is gold that he will give you to replace your OEM one. That one has to punch through on the back side. If it doesn't, this brake line will be free floating, and you really don't want that because over time it's going to wear and snap, and then you're going to have broken brake lines. Twin traction beams like to move up and down, okay, as you might have known from dynamics of the way the system is designed, so you don't want that to happen. Talked about bracketry. This was the bracket that I should have had that was designed and he gave me that should have fit. This was a 3-bolt. It did not fit for the passenger side. I had a 5-bolt. This was my bad. I did not communicate to him and tell him that. Same goes for the other side. This is what the top side of it looks like. You see 2 bolts and then 2 bolts on this side. The top does not change, but the back does. And then here is your finished product. Once this is installed, I had custom fab the right side. You don't have to do this, but clean up your mating surface on the pumpkin and rethread all those holes. You'll make it a lot easier on yourself. They're going to be gummed up and full of rust if you haven't plucked this pumpkin in 50,000 or 40,000 or 100,000 miles or whatever it is. You don't have to do this, like I said, but I would recommend it. It will make your life easier. This is how clean that mating surface looks after I took some Scotch-Brite to it and cleaned all the grease off and ran the bolts back through after they've been threaded. In this image is the passenger side axle shaft seal that goes to the pumpkin. Off to the right, you see the old one. The reason it's all bent up is that's what it took to get it out of there. Honestly, these weren't in bad shape on mine, just covered in grease and kind of grimy. It was time either way. I would highly recommend you go ahead and do it. They recommended it in the kit to do this as well. So just a close-up view of what that looks like whenever it's fully installed. Pro tip here, if you have any kind of way of locking this thing up to a workbench at 90 degrees, I would highly suggest it at that angle. The way that it's sitting in this picture, it'll make it a lot easier to conduct your work. I would highly suggest setting up your beam housing on top of your pumpkin where the pumpkin's facing vertically, just like in this image, where the mating of the two surfaces would not have to take place at an angle while you're laying underneath the truck, getting gasket sealer all over yourself. It's a whole lot easier to guide the beam on top of the axle housing and not make a mess by doing so. That way you can torque everything down, wait your 30 minutes, and then put it in. Guys, I pride myself in doing more with a whole lot less. I had this Warner workbench that was 300 pounds supported, and that pumpkin's roughly about 250, 300 pounds. I just slid it right across. This is usually a 2-man operation. This thing's so awkward to lift, but it just so happened to be the right height. I think this bench is about 2.5 feet tall. So if you need to find one that's similar, that's how I got it pinned up and did this by myself. If you don't got a buddy or a family member to help you lift this thing up, highly suggest this. All right, this piece of hardware is provided in your kit. It will have more threads than needed on the right side of that nut. You need to cut off about 5 threads so that it does not go all the way to the bottom and bottom out. And that's just the way that the kit is designed. That's what he gives you. This bottom bolt serves the same function as the top one. The top one is for the coil spring bucket. The bottom one is actually to support
the entire load. You have to cut about 3 threads off of this with a grinder in order to get this one to bottom out completely. That way it meets the mating surface, thus that you can torque it. Make sure you deburr it and grind it down properly before you do this, and then add some anti-seize and then the washer.
This I've already covered, but this is actually a washer that holds your coil over, or I'm sorry, your spring, I should say, in place. We're kind of backtracking here, but this bushing is what's going to be pointing towards the driver's side and then towards the passenger side based off what orientation you are in the truck. And I'm about to show you what I mean by that. It has to be sitting at this angle. That's how it's designed to be put in. You don't want to change that. Even an alignment shop shouldn't need to change that. Over time, a lot of these Fords tend to toe in and toe out and camber. That's because this moves. Here I'm just showing you what your spring retention hardware is and how it fits into that little slot. And I'm describing to you that the coilover that you will be provided with will not be able to fit inside that without really torquing it down. And I ended up having to bore that hole out about 3/16 of an inch wider for a 3/8 inch bolt. He gives you some smaller hardware. I personally could not get that hardware to fit, so I changed it. Here's another video right here of me talking about how I placed the nuts underneath and what rivets were in the way. Got to do some rivet dodging, guys, underneath. Pick and choose your battles. If you want to fight all the rivets, you can. But if you remove all of them, remember that hardware that you were taken out of the frame, you must replace with new hardware because those are structural components. I'm also discussing here what that brake line looked like on the right. If you have Moog ball joints, there's a common issue with the bottom retainer nut on the lower ball joint. If it is not forced all the way through the twin traction beam housing and gripping the surface on the inside of that hole, you will not be able to drive the nut on. And you're going to think something's wrong with the ball joint, and you're going to end up doing what I was doing here, which is fighting it. Really, honestly, what it torn down to is tightening the upper nut on the upper ball joint. That's all you need to do. All I'm here is showing you the difference between a stock ball joint and these new ball joints called TTX. TTX makes a great brand. I would still aim to get these, but be careful of getting the wrong length. This is your lower ball joint. This is what they commonly refer to as the kingpin on the D50s and D60s. By the way, D50 and D60 ball joints or the lowers are the same depending on what year you have. If you have a 96, 97, 95, they're all going to be the same. And I believe even 92s are the same if you have four-wheel drive. Make sure that you list that you have four-wheel drive if you go into AutoZone or O'Reilly's because the two-wheel drive ones are not the same. Really important that you get this right, guys. Here's just an image of the lower ball joint that I ended up going with. Ended up being a Moog. Wasn't entirely dissatisfied with them. Not entirely happy with them either. I'd rather go with Movotech or TTX Movotech, which is their top brand. Those are the best ones. If you have a four-wheel drive truck, odds are you got a 2-inch ball joint lower. All right, this is a highlight of a video I did earlier in a different series, but this is how everything is installed on the twin traction beam, and I'm talking about the placement of the washers. Now, he includes 4 silver washers in this kit. I called him just the other day and asked him what these silver washers are for because they do not seem to really have a place. They don't need to be installed in the F250s. It's just for the Broncos. So just toss these things, save them for a rainy day. You don't need them. Nonetheless, this is kind of how you assemble things, excluding that washer. Everything's kind of flipped upside down, sits right on top of that nut, as you can see in this video of how things are configured. Everything has an order in which it's installed, and it sits right on top of this nut. Put some anti-seize underneath that surface. Make sure that you got that gold washer underneath there so it does not wear through on the nut. And then your coil buckets and everything will connect to this, your springs. And then you got another washer on top of that with another nut that sits on top of that. And you can see I've got plenty of anti-seize installed here. Your spring itself, the coil part, will be retaining underneath there. And you can see in this video, I'm showing you that a specific spot that the smaller end of the coil will sit on top of that. If you've never installed these, I'm just kind of going through in a detailed fashion here because I hadn't done one in years. This retainer, this is exactly how it fits. On the very, very edge, it'll almost look like it's about to fall off, but it's not. That's just the way that it's designed. Don't worry about these being perfect, guys. Just get it mated up to that top surface. Like I said earlier, I had to bore through the top part of the bucket 3/8 of an inch in order to get a wide enough piece. And all I'm doing here is just showing you what that spring will look like when it sits on top of there. That rubber bushing, let's talk about that for a second. It will tend to leave out some it'll bust out pretty much. It'll look like it's about to fall off, but it's not. Also in this image, I was showing you what the leaf spring would look like when it's cut off. Do it better with a torch, guys. I'm going to go back and fix that. I didn't like the way it looks. The only reason you cut that off is because it's in your way. So that's the hardware I was showing you again. It's good hardware, guys, but it's just too small. It's not long enough. I wasn't particularly a fan of it, and I also somehow or another managed to lose the nuts. I am showing you this picture as a representation of how high you need to have that traction beam up, and then let's talk about the dampening spring off to the right, the Bilsteins. There are two rubber bushings. One goes on the top side of the coil bucket with the retaining washer that's circular, and then there's another retaining washer that goes on the bottom of the rubber bushing on the inside of the Bilstein on the back side of the bucket, so they sandwich each other. That's how it works. Reach this point, you've fully installed the kit. All that's left is the brake lines and extending your calipers and adding new brakes. The next video series, I'm going to talk about how I reinstalled all of my axle seals. I've got other videos that connect to that as well, and as well as the U-joints that connect to the pumpkin, and doing an alignment in your garage with what is set up and pinning everything together pretty much, cleaning everything up, tightening everything up, and doing an inspection.